I'm Susan. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a classical painter living in Port Angeles, Washington. I graduated from Georgetown Atelier some years ago, I think it was 2012. And since that time, I've been teaching a small class here in Port Angeles for people interested in learning those classical techniques. This video is was mostly designed for my students because I have a lot of questions that come up from them about the process of rendering in graphite, but I decided to make this available to everybody. So here you go. So this is about rendering, and rendering is vastly different than what we call shading, or what most people think of as shading. Shading is a rather gross process where you would use perhaps the side of a pencil or the side of a piece of charcoal or perhaps pastel. It's not finite. It's a beautiful process, could be beautifully used and look quite stunning and attractive when exercised on various different kinds of drawings. But in the atelier, I teach, as I learned, which is a form of shading called rendering, which is more finite. It's a very meticulous kind of work. It's very painstaking, and a lot of people think, well, I'll never do this, and that's true. A lot of people graduate from the class or move on and never really go back to rendering. But the process of rendering is one that lends itself to teaching the eye to understand value and value relationships in a way that nothing else quite does. It really forces you to slow down, to look carefully at what it is you're working from and understand what it is you're seeing, more so than any other process that I know of. But many people do go on to become professionals in the arena of graphite work, and you can see some quite stunning work out there. YouTube is full of it, I'm sure, and many of the art forums have people who work specifically and only in graphite. It is, for some of my students, their favorite medium, maybe mainly because it's probably the first one that they learn, but it can be a lot of fun, and it can also be very tedious. But all that aside, this is about learning to do rendering in graphite for my students and for anyone else who's interested in learning the process. I get asked a lot of questions about this process because there are some complexities involved with the pencils and knowing which one to use and where do I start and how do I start and which way do I go and what direction do I want to make my strokes, etc., etc. And so that's why I'm doing this video for the most part, because this way my students who are working independently or on their own on projects at home don't have to beat their brains out, start looking in notes. They can always come back and review this video and see what it is they need to remember or would like to learn afresh. So here we go. I'm going to start first by talking about the tools of the trade. So we're talking about graphite here, and I work in pencil, and so we work in my class with a variety of different techniques in pencil. So we start with, I would say, an array of pencils that goes from 9B to about a 2H. Now, you can get graphite pencils in a vast array of values being your lights and darks, going from the very soft darks all the way up to the very hard lights. So you can have anything from a 9B to 8B, 7B, 6B, 5B, 4B, all the way up to as much as a 4H. I've seen 4H being the lightest. That's a quite extraordinary range, and we have not felt the need to do that in our class. I feel that a range of about 6 or 7 pencils seems to work just fine. We skip every other one. So we start with going from the darkest and softest to the hardest and lightest pencils. So we start with a 9B, then go usually to a 6, then a 4, then a 2B, which we use also for doing most of our block-in and drawing, and then from a 2B to an HB, and then a 2H. This is a wide enough range to cover most of what we're trying to do, because each pencil in its own way has its own range of value. You can get quite light with a 9B, and you can get quite dark with a 9B, and so on with all of them. It's important to remember that the harder pencils, going from about HB on up, so HB, 2H, 3H, 4H, and so on, are getting lighter as they get harder. The H represents hard. And the B, for the B pencils, means soft. Don't ask me why. That's one I don't quite get yet, but it means soft, and it also means dark. So if we start with a 9B, 9B would be your softest pencil and your darkest pencil, and then going in a range from 9B up to 2B, they get slightly harder. So 6B would be, or you see 9, 8, so 6 would be a harder pencil, of course, than a 9, and 4 would be harder yet, and then 2 would be harder, or hard, and I would say somewhere between the two. HB is actually a cross between hard and soft, because it's got an H and a B. You can find pencils, as I said, between all of those in terms of range, but these would get you through the process pretty easily. So let's talk about the different pencils. I recommend to my students that they try to stick with one brand of pencil for the most part when they're dealing with softer pencils. This isn't always possible, but mainly the reason I say this is because each brand varies within its own brand. It varies in its range. So you could end up with a 2B in a Statler, for instance, that is much softer than a 2B in another brand. Let's just look at another brand and see what that might be. So this is a Statler. So let's see, Kimberly is another brand. And if you notice that a 2B and a 2B in one and a 2B in the other could be vastly different, or different enough that you would notice. So it's easier if you stick with one brand. But if you become familiar enough with the properties of each pencil, that would not necessarily be the most important thing. It helps, though, when you're first starting out. When it comes to the softer, darker range of pencils, I have found it difficult to find a 9B in a wooded pencil. So for my 9s and my 6s and even my 4s sometimes, I use a woodless pencil, and you've probably seen these in some of the art supply stores. There's no wood on the outside, it's just pure graphite. And you can sharpen these like you would any other pencil, you'll find that you can get a nice dark 9B in that, going all the way down to a 6. As is usually the problem in my studio, often I lend my tools out and then they disappear. So today I'm working with a slightly different range because I no longer have the range that I started out with. So I start with a 9B, and then I have here, what is this one? This is an 8B. Because I had it, so I thought I'd use it. And I have a 6B. And you can see that this is not a woodless pencil, it is a wooded pencil. And it's a Kimberly. The next pencil I have in my range is a 3B. I do not have a 4B. Somebody walked off with my 4B. And I've not had a chance to replace it. But there's not that much of a difference between a 3 and a 4B. And this pencil is also, I believe, a Statler. This is a Statler. Once I reach the 2B stage and I go from 2B to 2H, I switch to mechanical pencils. And I keep them all in different colored pencil holders. These are nice pencils. I really like using a mechanical pencil. These are not like the little tiny fine pointed ones that you buy in stores for just writing. These are art pencils. So I believe they are a 2 or 4 millimeter. Sometimes hard to see that. These are 2 millimeter pencils, so the leads are thicker than you would find in the kind of that you use for writing or some kind of work at your desk. These are different. I use different kinds of mechanical pencils, but you can get most of these online. The reason I like them is because you can get a really nice sharp point that'll hold its point for quite a period of time. So you're not stuck having to stop frequently to sharpen your pencils. The next one up I have, so it's a 2B, and I use that, as I said, for all my drawing and all my block ends. And primarily that's because anything softer gets harder to erase, and anything harder becomes impossible to erase because it scores the paper. So that is the one that we recommend to all our students to use. And then my next one up is an HB. I use a lot of that in rendering. And then the final one that I use is a 2H. These pencils, or these weights of pencil, were the ones recommended at Georgetown Atelier when I went to school, and I've sort of carried on that tradition. If you're interested in seeing some of the work done by students on graphite, you can check out my website at www.susanspar.com under Workshops and Classes and Student Gallery. I would also suggest, though, that you go to georgetownatelier.com. That's atelier is spelled ATELIER.com. And look under their student gallery of works done in graphite, and I think you'll be quite impressed. The work is really quite beautiful. I have more of a difficulty in photographing the work for my website because graphite can be difficult to photograph, but I think you can find some really good examples of it on the Georgetown website. Okay, for sharpening pencils, and sharpening is very important, I like to keep a very, very sharp point. And I recommend that to my students in order to do the work, because when we render with the point of the pencil, not the side of the pencil. So keeping it as sharp as possible is very important. So for sharpening my mechanical pencils, I use a mechanical pencil sharpener. This one is made by Pacific Arc. You can get these online. I get mine from, you can actually buy them on Amazon. And you can also get them from some of the art supply stores online, like Cheap Joe's and Jerry's Artorama. Those are two that I order from. But I've actually gotten these from Amazon. I like that because I can get them faster. It's quite easy to use them. You need to make sure your pencil point is extended just far enough that it doesn't crack when you put it inside. And then you simply rotate the sharpener, and you'll get a nice sharp point with them. If we're talking about woodless pencils, like these that I was discussing before, you can sharpen this in any standard pencil sharpener, or you can do what I sometimes do, which is sharpen it by hand with a razor blade. I like to use a razor blade when it comes down to that. I don't have a lot of pencil sharpeners in my studio, and I was trained at a really early age to sharpen my pencils with a razor blade, so that's my preference. This is not a class, though, on Pencil Sharpening 101. Whatever you decide to do, keep your pencils very sharp. This particular one here, or both of these, I'm not sure if you can see them. I'll hold my hand in front so you can get a better idea of the points, are quite sharp, and these are wooded pencils, and I sharpened them with a razor blade. Okay, for erasing, very important for us, I use a kneaded eraser. Now I have one, pardon me, that has already been broken in. As you can see, it's nice and soft. And this one is new. This is what they look like when you buy them. This is General's kneaded eraser. And the reason we use kneaded is because it doesn't break down the surface of the paper. You'll be able to retain your paper and the surface much easier with a kneaded eraser than you will any other kind of eraser. Another point, pardon me. is another point about kneaded erasers, that you can sharpen them. You can make little sharp areas out of them. You can knead them to different shapes to get into corners and tight spots on your drawing, and that's very helpful. Okay, paper. Usually when my students are starting out, I insist that they get a good drawing and then transfer it to good papers, because for new students who are first learning to do accurate block ends, there's a lot of difficulty in getting an accurate drawing right away without a lot of erasing. And so in order to keep the drawing clean, we have them work out the drawing first on something like Strathmore 400 series paper. And then when they have the drawing as accurate as possible, we transfer that drawing by making a copy of it at a copy store or on your personal copier. And then by going over the back of it with a stick of graphite, you can get a nice heavy stick and roughen the back of the Xerox copy or the copy. We flip that over and place that carefully on the good paper, and then with a ballpoint pen, go around the drawing and transfer that drawing in graphite to the paper. We try to do this with a light touch, not by bearing down. You do not want to score your paper. Any scoring you put in the paper is going to interfere with the drawing and is going to create darker marks because it will grab, or lighter marks because it will grab the graphite differently. So you want to be cautious about that. As for finishing paper, what we do is I have my students transfer to a piece of watercolor paper, and this is usually, or has to be, I would say, a good piece of hot pressed watercolor paper. We use two kinds. We use either Lanacorel or Aquarel, and we use the side that is the smoothest. So this is something that differs between both brands. You have to close your eyes and very gently feel both sides. One side will feel a little bit smoother. That's the side you want to use. I don't recommend using a Bristol when you're first starting out with this. There's not enough tooth, and you may have a great deal of difficulty in learning to use your medium on that paper to start. It's great for advanced people, advanced graphite draftsmen, but not for beginners or even intermediate students. I think it's way too difficult to find enough tooth to get a nice, clean drawing. Okay, so once you have your drawing transferred and you have it on good paper, then you can start your work. And so here I would, at this point, I'm going to break from my close-up and we're going to zoom in so you can see both my setup that I'm working from and the piece that I'm working on, my easel. So on my setup, I have placed a small white ball which has a light on it. Now I've softened that light somewhat because I have an inline dimmer switch that I got from Home Depot. Great little tool, and it allows you to regulate the amount of light on your subject. And I have my north light window open so that enough natural light falls in and softens the shadow. Shadows cast by a direct light bulb usually create a very hard shadow, and I'm looking for something a little softer. It won't be as soft as what you would see under just north light or light coming in from any window, but it is much softer than it would be if it was just the direct light up close on this ball. You will see also a line going diagonally through the ball, and that line is what we refer to as the Terminator Line, or some people call it the coarse shadow line between light and dark. And so you'll see that, and you'll also see a cast shadow. I'm going to try to get the camera up close enough that you can see the detail work as I work, and you'll be able to hear me talk you through the exercise as I do it. And at the same time, you'll be able to see my setup. I'll have that looped in a small box in the corner of your screen, so you should be able to see both at the same time. So that's it. See you in a minute. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to be working a little bit to the side here so that you can still see my drawing and without any head interruptions or interference from me. I'll do my best to stay out of the way of the camera. Makes my work here a little tight, but that's as it may be. Okay. If you look carefully at my drawing and you look carefully at the photograph or the camera setup of the ball that's in the corner, you'll notice that the darkest place that you can see on the ball is at the very base of it, right underneath that little sphere there. You'll see that the very bottom of that ball where it sits and it touches the table is the deepest, densest shadow. So my students always ask me where to start first, and the answer to that question is with your darkest star. And the main reason we want to start with the darkest star is that we want to have a scale upon which we can measure and compare every other value as we work the sphere in the circle, or as we work our subject. So I'm going to start with my very softest pencil, which is about a 9B, and I'm going to very lightly start to work into the base of the shadow. Now, one thing to remember is that when we are working our shadows in a drawing with this kind of rendering, we work always in a horizontal stroke. So all our strokes within the shadow area, this is the shadow area, this is the shadow area, will all be horizontal. We don't go this way diagonally, we don't go up and down, we don't go in different directions. We keep all our strokes even, all our strokes in a horizontal direction, and we try to build them very slowly. The pressure on your pencil should be very light. We are not using the pressure on our pencil to build the darkness or the value of the graphite. We're merely using it, what we need to do is if we want to darken it, we simply go over it. So in order to remain consistent and keep your strokes nice and even, we want to go always in a horizontal position and with a very soft stroke. You will have some areas where you tend to build up a ridge that looks something like, I suppose I could do it here, between two pieces. When you see that, all you need to do is go slightly with a slight overlap over it and try to even that stroke out so that you end up with a nice even tone all the way through. We're looking for even tones here. We're not looking for anything that even close to resembles stroke direction. The point is to not see your strokes. So we work very slowly and very patiently. You don't try to race this. This is not a race. And slow wins the race in this kind of work. So here, I keep rotating my pencil as I work, because if I do that, I can keep my pencil sharp and go longer without having to sharpen the pencil. Now, so far this is not the darkest spot, but I'm not ready to build up my tone there yet to get it dark. I'm just aiming now for a slight mid-tone all the way around. It's a little hard for me to get completely parallel here because I'm working on an angle so that you can see my work and I don't get in the way of the camera. If at any point I do, I will make sure I move out of the way so that you can see what I've done. But you can see I'm keeping my strokes as nice and even as I possibly can. Yes, when I get to areas like this where it's round, I do sort of very gently move around that, that circle so that I can come up to it without being in danger of going straight across the line. Now I've got enough tone in, I want to come back and I want to reestablish this dark underneath here. Make sure when you're doing this that you are looking at your subject, not just your drawing. It won't do you any good if you're not looking at your subject. You need to be constantly checking and rechecking the values of your drawing against what you see. I do a lot of squinting in this work because squinting allows you to close out the color cones in your eyes and see mostly value. It also helps to take a good look or to register contrast. The contrast between two areas will tell you whether or not you're in the correct value range. There is another tool which we use that I have failed to mention. So I'm going to break for a minute and I'll explain how that one works too. We call that a black mirror. Now if you don't have a black mirror, you can simply use your cell phone, because a black mirror is nothing more than a piece of acetate or plastic that has been blackened on one side with a nice reflective side or tone on the other. So I'll be demonstrating that for you in just a minute. But I'm not going to stop the camera at this point to do it. So here I'm slowly building the town. I can see that things are much darker here. I am not pressing down on the graphite. I'm simply going over it with the same amount of pressure on the pencil that I've been using thus far. I often tell my students, if you're done with that shadow in less than an hour, you're working too fast. I promise not to take a full hour to do my shadow here, though. We're going to be moving as fast as we can so that you can see how we cover the area. As I move up along the shadow area here, I'm constantly going back, squinting at the setup and at my drawing to determine what is the difference in contrast between this deep area here and this area here, and how much darker or lighter I need to get. So as I squint down at my subject matter, I can see that I can afford to get another half tone darker here, another half step in the graphite. I'm still sticking with my very soft pencil. I'm still sticking with my 9B. There's no reason to change from that 9B at this point. So depending on your camera, you may be seeing a slightly different value than what I'm actually rendering here, mainly because I can't account for everybody's computer screen, and I can't account for my own camera. I can only adjust so much, so you're liable to be seeing variations in this than in something that's not quite representative of what's going on. But what's more important is that you see the technique and the what we call the relative values. So you can tell that this value is dark, but not as dark as this value. Whether or not you see the actual value on your screen will not make a difference as long as you can see the relative value between those two. When we think of relative values, it helps to think of a piano scale. If you think of the octave of middle C, and then you think of an octave that is just above middle C, all the notes will be the same as they are at middle C. They will just be a higher key, or if you go down, a lower key. But the relative changes between, for instance, an A chord and a D chord, or a C chord and an F chord, are always going to be the same regardless of where you are, whether you're in a hierarchy or a lowercase. The differences between those are going to remain the same. So that's relative. Okay, so I'm moving out to the edges of the shadow here. So you can see, now, one of the things that I teach my students when they're first learning this process is that in order to learn to judge their values accurately, it helps if they have something to match the value against. So what we do is we build a moat around the subject as we go, which represents the value of, for instance, in this case, the tabletop and the background piece of paper that I have on my setup. So the colors there, because they are colored, unfortunately, don't have just black or white or gray paper, is a soft brown. But if you squint down, or you use your black mirror, not magic mirror, your black mirror, you'll be able to tell the relative difference between the values of the tabletop and the values of the shadow. So what you're looking for here is the difference in contrast between those two areas. So here, I can see that the shadow can afford to get somewhat darker. It's still pretty light as far as shadow work goes. This can afford to get a little darker and a little denser. I'm rotating my pencil to keep it sharp. I'm not bearing down hard on this pencil to get this darkness. To do so would be to create a very distinct mirror of my graphite surface, because graphite can tend to be very shiny and very mirror-like. So as much as possible, I want to avoid that. You can't avoid it all, but you certainly don't want to bear down. And then if you had to lift off some of that graphite, if you got too dark, you'd have another issue. So it's better to work by not bearing down, keeping a nice even pressure on your pencil throughout your drawing stage. It takes a great deal of patience to do this well, because you may find yourself having to go over a drawing or an area of a drawing several times. One thing about using soft pencils, like when you're working in the lower range of the B pencils, is that they tend to be very grainy compared to the graphite that comes off of a hard pencil like an HB or even just a 2B. And a lot of students don't like that. They'll say, well, it looks real, rough, it looks grainy, it doesn't look as nice as the HB or the 2H does. And that is true, it is grainier, but there are ways to compensate for that, and I will discuss them as we draw closer to that time. So at this point, I'm going to speed the camera up a bit. But I want to just make a note here that as we get closer to the edges of a shadow, more light is cast into that shadow from the surrounding environment. So you end up with a lot of, you end up with a very soft edge of the shadow, as I mentioned before, because we're dealing with a softer light source. And you also end up with a lighter edge of the shadow all the way throughout here, because more light is being cast into it from the environment. So I always keep that in mind, and I watch for that as I move out to the edges of a shadow. Sometimes it's more apparent than at other times. Now I'm getting a little bit of a ridge here that I don't like, so I'm coming in on either side of it, and I'm evening that tone out as much as possible. When I end up with a ridge that really disturbs me, I'll come back with my eraser, make a very, very sharp little point out of it, and then just touch it to those areas to lift off anything that disturbs me or bothers me. I can then go back in with my pencil, keeping my point very sharp, and clean that up. You will find it easier to work with your pencil if you hold it, and to maintain an even pressure, if you hold it at the end of the pencil rather than all the way down here, where if you're all the way at the tip of your pencil, your tendency is going to be to bear down very heavily on it. And then you're going to end up with a pretty dark and rough-looking piece of graphite rendering. So I would always suggest that when we draw with the end of the pencil. It takes a little practice, but you'll get used to it. And as you can see, as I'm working with the point of the pencil. I'm not working with the side of the pencil. Always keeping the point at about a 45-degree angle, 45 to 50-degree angle to the paper. I'm just softening my edges here a little bit, because that's not a hard shadow. It could also tend to be, needs to be a little darker. And I want to make sure that I have the relationship between these two areas as accurate as possible before I move out into the surrounding area, because I want to find the contrast between the tabletop and the shadow in order to get an accurate read on that. Right now, though, I'm only working between the shadow and the inside, or the very bottom base shadow of the ball on the tabletop. So now I'm just darkening because I can afford to do that, so we'll speed up the camera a little bit while I work. Okay, so now I want to start moving from I feel like the relationship between these two is pretty good, and I want to move up. Now, you will notice that there is a small double reflection here of the ball in the tabletop. I'm going to ignore that for the most part. It's not important to the drawing, it's not integral to the drawing. It's kind of hard to ignore or avoid, on this tabletop, because it's a highly polished piece of board. But for the most part, it's not necessary to the drawing, and it can confuse the viewer if it's not done well. So I'm just going to ignore that for the most part. All right, so now when we're ready to move up, we want to take another look at what's going on between this very bottom here and here. I don't need to start the tabletop at this point. I want to stay consistent with the ball and move around the ball. However, as I come up on these edges of the ball, I will be rendering the edges, or a small moat, of the tabletop as I move around, always comparing this value to this value to the one I just placed, that value to the one I placed before it, and so on as I move around the ball. I don't want to jump all over the ball or all over the tabletop, because I will lose control of my values in doing that. It's very important to maintain that control in order to make sure that your relative values remain consistent throughout the drawing. So I'm still using a 9B here, and I think just by Using it a little lighter here on the bottom as I move up, I can maintain that. I don't need to go to a harder pencil. Now, as I look carefully, I can see that the value, as I squint between here and here, is very, very slight. There's a very slight value change. It gets just minimally lighter. It's not very much lighter. You'll notice also that because I'm on the shadow side of the Terminator line, this is the Terminator line, or also known as the core shadow, we are staying horizontal in our strokes. We're not moving diagonally or vertically in our strokes. We just keep maintaining that horizontal stroke. So I'm always asking myself as I move up, do I need to get darker here? Is this getting darker or is this getting lighter? What do I need to do? I check frequently into my black mirror to see whether or not I need to change any of the relative values and if I'm still working on the right track. So it stays pretty much the same here, but if you'll notice carefully, the value here against the shadow gets darker against the shadow than on the ball than lighter. So if you look at the contrast between the two, I need to come down in value here as I move up on the ball, maintaining a certain amount of density of the value, keeping it darker. So yes, I'm lighter now, but I'm going to be getting darker as I move into it because I need to go over it several times in order to build up the tone on it. So again, I can go a little bit adjacent to the circle for a short distance and then come back into it with a horizontal stroke. So I'm doing this very slowly because I want to maintain that control. So at this point, the two values are very close, but now I need to make it darker. This value here is very close to this value here, but not as dark as the underlying shadow. Now as I come around, I can see that I need to lighten up some of this area in my shadow here. So I'm going to take my eraser and just very carefully lift off some of that graphite. In order to conserve my values, I need to get a little lighter here, or I will be too dark on the ball. As I move up, it's kind of funny. At this point now, the bowl is starting to lighten up a little bit. I have more light from the lit side of the tabletop reflecting back into the bowl, making the shadow side here a little bit lighter as we move up. But I need to check that value as well against here. So I want to compare now the tabletop value against the value of the ball. And by squinting down, I can still see how much darker I need to get. Most of that darkness is right on the very edge here. There's a very subtle darkening right along the edge of the ball. It's not really an outline, but it is a very subtle darkening as it comes to the edge of the ball. but I want to register that comparison now to the tabletop. So if I squint down at the tabletop, and I can see how much of a value difference I need to add between these. So I'm going to switch to a slightly harder pencil now and move away from this pencil just for a moment. I'll come back to it as I continue to work in this area. But for now, I want to come up to about what would be 6B. Now, I am working on a lit area, so when I'm working, usually when you're working on the form, you want to work diagonally. I'm going to be doing that the same here. When you're working on the lit side of it, we work diagonally. And the reason we're doing that is it will create more of an illusion of form on the ball, but it will also help us to differentiate between our lights and our darks here on this surface. So you want to go diagonal to the source of the light. The light is coming in this direction, so diagonal to that is this kind of a stroke. Again, I'm keeping my strokes nice and even. My tone is as even as I possibly can. I need to get a little bit darker to find the right contrast between these three areas, these three surfaces. The edge of the bowl, the edge of the shadow, and the edge of the table here. So I'm rotating my pencil. I found a burr in it. Occasionally you will find a burr or a little sharp area in your pencil. All you need to do is rotate it, or you can work it off on another piece of paper until it's coming down nice and smooth. Maintain that point. You always want a 45-degree angle to your surface of your paper. Always checking with my black mirror whenever necessary to make sure that I've got the right contrast or value relationships between my surfaces. So as I move up on all of these surfaces, I'm going to want to continue checking one value against the other consistently throughout. I'm going to move now into the center of the bowl a little bit more, so I want to switch back to my 9B. I also need to sharpen my 9B. It's getting a little on the dull side. I use a razor blade to do that, but you can use a pencil sharpener as well. Here we are with a nice sharp pencil again. Working back into my, again I've switched back to a horizontal stroke. I think I picked up a B in my studio here in the background. I've got the doors open today. It's one of our rare warm days in Washington in the early spring. Very hard to be in here doing this because I'd much rather be sitting out on my patio soaking up the sun. Okay, so you can see I'm picking up a darker stroke here. I'm going to take that out with my eraser. Sometimes that's just due to something in the paper. A mar or some kind of defect in the surface of the paper. I failed to mention at the beginning of this that when you mount your paper, you want to mount it on some foam core. I have a piece of foam core here, it's about 1/4 of an inch, and the reason you want foam core, you want it without any Mars, dents, or otherwise, is because it provides a nice cushion for your drawing and for your pencil to work on. And you don't want any Mars, dents, or other imperfections in it, because those will translate right through the paper onto your drawing. You'll either pick up more or less graphite, and it'll be almost impossible to get that out. So you can see I'm really laying the graphite in lightly here. I don't have a lot of tone going down. I'm being very careful about it. I'm going to pull out that little mark now that's been bugging me. As I move over here onto this side of the shadow area, you will notice on the bowl that there's a lot of reflected light in this area. We have a little expression that we use in my class, which I learned from Susan Deal when I took a workshop from her a long time ago. And that's that, and I make my students repeat this. They're probably laughing as they watch this now, but it's sort of become a joke, because Susan Deal made us march around like a bunch of crazy people around the classroom when she taught it to us. And that was, reflected light lives in the shadow, which essentially means that it's part of the shadow, and therefore should be treated as part of the shadow and not part of the light. So essentially that means that nothing on the shadow side should be as light as anything on the lit side. Now sometimes you'll be working in from plaster cast or something like this white ball, and if you had something like a white piece of paper underneath, the reflected light coming up could be very, very intense. So intense it almost seems to be as bright as the direct light on the subject. If that happens, and it often does when you're working from plaster, you don't want to draw your reflected light or render your reflected light as bright as you see it on the ball or on your subject matter. And that's because it will confuse the viewer. So we try to avoid that as much as possible. We don't run into that here because the surface on which the ball is sitting is a darker surface, so we're not getting that strong reflected light. But the way I handle that is I don't want to lay the pencil in or the graphite in so dark that that I have to lift it off. I don't want to have to go through what I just went through over here. I'd rather not have to take pencil off or graphite off. I'd rather just darken it as it needs to be darkened rather than lighten it as it needs to be lightened. So I'm paying very careful attention to how much pressure or buildup I'm allowing on the graphite on this section of the drawing here, because I want to come back and adjust the value by going back over it rather than lifting anything off. Now I still need to register the value of the tabletop here, and by keeping this fairly light, that allows me to a little bit of wiggle room to come in and lay in that value and adjust the 3 edges here, as I did on this side, so I can register this value against it and know how I'm doing, keeping my value relationships consistent and accurate. This is quite uncomfortable for me because I'm used to working straight on to the surface, not quite on an angle like this, so my shoulder is going to pay the price tonight. So I'm coming up on an area of the Terminator line called the coarse shadow. The coarse shadow always falls on a turning edge. The turning edge meaning a rounded edge, an edge that is making a slow turn, not necessarily a fast turn. So you won't find it on something like a box where you've got a 90-degree turn. That will not necessarily have a coarse shadow. But anything that's rounded will have a coarse shadow. And what that means is that as the subject is turning from the dark, from the shadow side into the light, it is slowly gathering more light, more light, more light, just like a half moon, okay? Until you move up into the very lit area of it. Depending on the way the subject is lit, you will either see a strong coarse shadow and a strong Terminator line, or you'll just see a very soft, gradual turning of the form. Because I have this set up the way it is, you're going to see a nice line between your light and your dark. I did this purposely, and the Terminator line with a nice coarse shadow. If you look carefully, very carefully at the subject, you'll notice that there is a slight density that occurs right here near the Terminator line. This is the coarse shadow. You'll notice this because you'll see this more on a subject where there is a reflected light than you would on a subject that has no reflected light. If I were to remove any of the reflection or reflected light hitting the side of the ball over here, you would not see a coarse shadow. You would see the Terminator line, but you would not see a coarse shadow. You would just see a dense shadow and then a moving into the light with halftones from the coarse shadow, the Terminator line moving into the light. The coarse shadow occurs as the result of reflected light coming into or being reflected onto the shadow side of the subject. One reason we like to draw and paint in classical work with a good light source and a good strong light and nice shadows is because we get that Terminator line and we get that coarse shadow, which really helps the subject to turn in space. There's an expression we use called turning the form. A lot of people just roll their eyes when they hear that one because it's used so much. But it's a very good expression for describing what happens when the subject appears three-dimensional. And we want our work to look very three-dimensional. And value is what helps to describe that. Value does all the work, and unfortunately, color gets all the credit. So here I've got another little dark area coming up as a result of my overlapping two areas. I'm going to just smooth that out a bit, clean it up. Seems very picky, I know. But it's the difference between really good work and mediocre work. So far I'm just adding a very light tone here. I haven't yet deepened that tone, and I'm still working with a very soft pencil. I'm working with a 9B. I yet don't know exactly what this value is because I haven't worked in the tabletop behind it. Just because the value is this value here on the tabletop does not necessarily mean it will be the same up here. You need to constantly be checking to see how those values change according to how the light falls on the tabletop. It's a little bit like watching grass grow, right? I'm not sure if you're still with me, but I sure hope you are. Okay, so I've got this nice even tone going here, and now I want to just take a look to see where things darken up and where they tend to lighten up. I know I need, if I squint down, I need to darken this down, not as dark as the edges here, but then I need to make it a little denser as I come in, and a wee bit more dense as I get close to the coarse shadow. So I'll continue with my 9B, and we'll speed things up at this point. All right, so at this point, I'm going to switch back now to my 6B as I move up here to the tabletop again, because I want to, again, rediscover the value of the tabletop as opposed to in contrast to the edge of the bowl. So we're going to work diagonally because we're in the lights. So you'll notice that I'm only creating a small moat. I'm not taking this all the way out to the edge. That's something you can do at a later time, or at a time when you're not pressed for time, or when you decide how you want to finish off your drawing. It's not necessary to do it at this stage. Mostly all I want to do now is I want to set up a comparison for light and dark. I can tell by the contrast here that nothing much changes in the contrast on the table here between this section of the table and this section of the table here, but there is more darkness on the corner of the ball. So I want to come back to my 9B and reinforce that again. I'm also going to resharpen my pencil because the sharp point will get me more graphite onto the paper. If my pencil's dull, I'm not going to be able to put down as much graphite. So I can see that the contrast between here needs to be increased. The edge of the bowl needs to get a little darker. Between the background here and the background of the bowl here, when I squint down, the value is almost identical. There's almost no difference between this background and this one. So I'm not going to worry too much about this one at the moment. I'll need to work out this value in order to determine how the bowl shifts at that point. But here, because we're up near the Terminator line or the core shadow, there is an increased density in this area of the bowl. Because the edge here and here is going to be somewhat lost because the values are the same, I am not going to switch pencils. I'm going to maintain the same pencil as I move into the background moat area of the drawing. So right here, while this gets darker, as you can see, than the tabletop, the value is roughly the same as the bowl. It's a lost edge. It's important that you resist the temptation to darken the edge of your ball to create a line-like effect. It's not important to differentiate these two. The eye will make the distinction for you. As a matter of fact, my drawing here is a little on the dark side. I had darkened it so that the camera would pick it up, but I'm going to remove that now. I want the eye of the viewer to fill in that information. It's not important that the drawing actually delineate that. Your eye will tell you that the bowl continues to curve there. I don't need to draw that in. So I'm going to come back and fill that in, clean it up a little bit. Diagonal here. And I'm just going to have to make little circles here. So I've been looking this whole time at the value distinction between this part of the tabletop right here and this part of the paper in the background. Consistently trying to keep this value contrast consistent, and making sure that this one dissolves into it also, because they are the same value. And so now you can see that this is starting to read somewhat correctly. I may need to darken some area here because this is part of the core shadow. There's a little bit of reflected light in this area. It's very difficult to see. I don't know if the camera is picking it up, but it's there. And now I can allow myself to move down here into the reflected light area after I've rendered the table, knowing the difference in tone between this area and the table. I can then adjust the values of the reflected light area, the tabletop, and the shadow so that they all reflect what I am seeing in my subject matter. So I'm working back up now into the core shadow area, where there needs to be a little bit more reinforcement of the shadow. And we do this because, not just because I can see it, but because when you have a good core shadow, the object turns in space. It looks more three-dimensional on your drawing than it would otherwise. So the use of having a little bit of reflected light and a little bit of coarse shadow goes a long way in bringing about a nice three-dimensional effect on your drawing. So I'm adjusting some shadows. It's been a couple of days. I had to step away from the work for a couple of days because I had other things to take care of. So now that I'm back, I can see some things I want to change. Getting some distance from your work makes a big difference. You'll notice that when you come back and you re-examine a piece that you've been away from for a few days or even a few hours, it's going to make a huge difference in your perspective on that piece. And you'll be able to see more clearly the mistakes that you've made and some of the changes that need to be affected in order to bring your work about. One of the things I'm constantly doing for myself, though, is reevaluating what I see in terms of value. I'm always asking myself, is it lighter or is it darker? And when I paint, of course, I'm always also asking myself, is what I'm looking at warmer or cooler in terms of color temperature. But this video is of course just about black and white. Now that I've been staring at a light bulb for a while, I have to keep closing my eyes. I'm trying to get an idea as to whether or not this value is the same as this value or darker or lighter than that value, and it's pretty hard to tell. I'm trying to squint, but I have this image of a light bulb sticking right where I'm staring, so it's making it a little hard for me to determine. I think that the background is just a touch darker. You're pretty close, though. I'm using a Maul stick here, which is really just a cane that I can hook over the drawing to steady my hand so I don't have to rest my hand on the drawing, thereby smudging the pencil. These two values are so close, they might as well be identical. It's all right to lose an edge. Losing an edge makes the viewer use their imagination, and their brain will fill in the information for you. It makes a more interesting drawing or painting than giving the viewer every single detail. Okay, so you'll notice that there's it's gotten a little outliney over here. It's because when I drew my circle, I wanted it dark enough that the camera would be able to pick it up, but I don't like the look, of course, from drawing, and so I want to lift some of that off. In the process of getting the background in, or the tabletop in, which is about this value over here, similar value to this one, I could tend to lose some of that if the value were the same as the pencil line. If it was the same as the pencil line, then I just needed to match that pencil line, and that line would virtually disappear. But it's not. It's a little lighter than that line, and so I'm going to try to lift off some of that graphite and see if I can't lighten that up a bit. Now, the best way to do this is not to erase, but more to just sort of dab at it with your eraser. And that's one of the nice things about a kneaded eraser is I can make it into a nice thin little line. It makes it rather much easier to get in there and kind of lift off precise areas of the drawing without over smudging or getting into other areas. Now, I have picked up some of the graphite on the in the reflected light area down here, but that can easily be fixed. Just go back into it. So there you go. I've managed to pick that up quite nicely, and I'm going to go back in. I probably used about a 4B on that, so I'm going to go back and see if I can get a 4B or a 3B. If I remember correctly, I don't have a 4B, just a 3. Again, I want to mesh these two areas, so I'm trying to stay as light as I can, letting the graphite build up slowly on its own so I can really pull those two areas together without getting a lot of overlap. And I think that looks much better than it did before. Now, in order to ascertain that this value is correct, what I want to do is try to get in some of the tabletop around it, because I'm going to start moving up out of the coarse shadow with the Terminator line into the light area. So I want to get the value for this portion of the table, and I think I probably used about a 6 there. It's been a couple of days, so I'm not quite sure, but a 6, it's pretty easy to regulate or to match your values if you're even in the ballpark, because each pencil, although might be harder or softer than the one next to it, or in terms of range, each pencil has a range. So you can get pretty dark even with a 2B, and you can get pretty dark even with a pretty light even with a 4B, or even a 6B can go light. The difference is going to be in the way it comes out, the way it looks when it hits the graphite hits the paper. The softer the pencil, the grainier the look. If you notice here, this is pretty grainy. This has all been done with a very soft pencil, an 8 or a 9B. As I move into a slightly harder range, like a 4 or a 6B, it gets a little finer. Once I start moving up into the really hard ranges, it gets even finer. We can get rid of this graininess, or at least soften it out quite a bit when the entire drawing is done, by going over it with a very hard pencil, like for instance a 2H or an HB. 2H is even more preferable. It will not change very much the value of the drawing, but it will fill in all this little graininess looking area, making it much more attractive. So I've got a 6B here, which I think is pretty much what I used there. I'm going to try to get my tabletop in with that. So when I do it here, when I'm doing this here, right alongside the shadow line or the shadow area, what I want to do is squint down at my subject and compare these two values on my subject, and then come back and do the same thing on my drawing to see if the contrast is about the same. I think I can afford to get a little darker here. The value here is going to be darker than that of the ball, so I need to get darker. They're close values. I've been going in a parallel line here, even though this is virtually in the light, and so I want to change that to diagonal. If I were going to be rendering the surface of the table or the wood grain on that, I would be going parallel to the tabletop rather than on a diagonal the way I normally do in the light. Diagonal is more important on the turning form than it would be on something flat like this surface, but as I started it here, I'm going to continue it here. If I were working to get in all that grain, I would instead be going horizontal, of course, because that would match the grain of the wood and be easier to pull that all together. But because I started here in the diagonal, I'm going to continue that here. So you always want to consider a little bit about the surface that you're rendering and what you're trying to say about it. And what the value is when you're choosing the direction of your strokes. Nominally and generally what we do is we try to go always in a horizontal format when we're in the shadows, and diagonal when we're in the lights. But that can change, as I said, if you're doing something like a flat table surface where you really want to pick up the direction of the stroke or of the table grain. Here I'm not going to be doing the table grain, so I'm just going to leave it as a diagonal. I don't think it'll make much of a difference. If this is done well enough, you shouldn't even notice the direction of the strokes. When I get really close to the edges here, rather than trying to go straight through with a diagonal line, worrying about crossing over this area, I start working in small circles. I don't know if you can see my pencil, but if you can, what I'm doing, and I'll illustrate it over here. Let me see, I'm not sure if you can see that. I'll illustrate it right here. I'm doing these really small circles. So my pencil's actually doing this, but on a much more finite level. It makes it a little easier to come up against those lines and to pull the two forms together. Then as I move away from that area, those circles sort of flatten out into ovals, and those ovals flatten out into diagonal lines. So I'm getting that value just a touch darker than the ball around it, which is what my aim is. Little achy shoulder here. Slept badly last night. Now I'm moving right along very edge of the ball. So I'm making those loops again, going a little crosswise to the strokes I've already laid down. But as you can see, it doesn't seem to make a difference. My pencil's very, very light on the edge, but you can feel the difference in those two values, and that's what I was aiming for, was to get that difference in values there. And make it very noticeable. Again, patience is really important in this work. Slow wins the race. You'll have a much nicer looking drawing if you keep your strokes to a small area and try to develop that area as nicely as you can, and then slowly move up and out of it, but not try to rush your work. So here I'm going to watch my values because it's getting a little lighter on the table as it moves a little closer to where the light is. The light is coming down and it's just glancing off the ball here, but it's really hitting the table back here. So as you move closer, of course, to the light source, things get lighter and brighter. And it's subtle, but it's there. And so I'm going to try to get that subtle lightening of value, and then I want to compare it to the value I lay in here. So once I have these three areas in, I'll know that I'm close if I can compare and contrast those values with what I'm seeing on the subject. So again, I'm coming close to the edge here. What I want to do is I want to pull in my strokes a little bit, and I'm just making those little circles as light as I can, close to the edge. Rotating my pencil as I go because that keeps my pencil point sharp. So now I'm pulling two areas together, the area closest to the ball that I just laid in, and this area right next to it, adjacent to it. So there are a few areas I would like to clean up with my eraser, but for the most part, it's looking pretty clean. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm not going to be completing all of these areas. I will probably try to get some of the areas here in front of the shadow and most of the area going around the ball in order to demonstrate how these values work together and how I match values up as I move around the outside of the ball and into the lid area. But I don't think it's necessary to film all this, and I don't think you really want to watch that. Okay, so I'm ready to cross my Terminator line into the lights now. And generally what I do to facilitate that is I move from a 2B to, I go back to a 2B in order to cross the core shadow, and then immediately start shifting to lighter and harder values as I move out. So harder pencils, lighter values as I move out into the lights to do it. But the transition from the core shadow to here, depending on how dark these halftones are on just the other side of the core shadow, I can generally get those with a 2B, and that provides a really nice transition. Sometimes I may go to a slightly softer pencil, like perhaps a 3B here into this area, or a 4B, depending on what I use to render it. But nothing hard, nothing softer than that, and certainly nothing harder than that. I don't want a sharp transition, I want a slow transition here, because if you look carefully at the setup, you'll see that there are nice, gentle halftones in these areas, and I want to capture those. So I'm going to start with a 2B and see how that serves me, and I'm going to be working here in the lights. I usually work from this area first, so I'm going to slowly tighten it. Now we want to definitely go diagonal because the light is coming in this direction, so I want to make sure my pencil is moving in a diagonal fashion to the source of the light. So that's going to be like this. And I'm keeping that pretty close, I'm keeping this transitional value pretty close to the Terminator line. I'm not carrying my pencil strokes too far out. So I'm doing a lot of squinting here to see what I need to do to bring these values to the right contrast between the halftone and the coarse shadow area. And as long as I squinted that one and I squinted this one, I can tell that I need to get a little darker in here. So what I think I'm going to do, I'm going to move to a 3B. Normally, I won't go back over a hard pencil with a soft one. And I think I can just about manage that here without too much of a problem. But here, you can still see that with a harder pencil, you end up with a nice, smooth, ungrained look. It's even just a 3B is less grainy than these softer pencils here. So why wouldn't I use like a 2B if I've got a wide range of value that I can attain with it? Why wouldn't I use that down here in the shadows? Well, the problem with that is you get to the point with it that you start to have so much reflection, so much hard graphite filling up the tooth that it starts to shine like a mirror. You're going to end up with some reflection no matter what you do on graphite drawing, but you really want to avoid too much of that if you can. So you're really I always tell my students, use the softest pencil you can to do the job. And you can see that I'm doing a pretty good job with the 3B matching the value of the 2B. It's doing just a fine job. Of course, these are two different pencil points, so they're probably pretty close anyway. Sometimes that'll happen between manufacturers. Okay, so now I can start to lighten up a little bit. I'm going to switch back to my 2B. I'm keeping my pencil point very, very sharp. And don't forget to go and don't forget to go look at your subject as you do this, because it's not uncommon to get so caught up in your drawing that you forget to check your values on your subject. I have to walk around and sometimes kick my students and say, hey, look at your drawing. You missed that. It's your subject. You're spending so much time looking at your drawing that you're forgetting to look at your subject and you're missing a value change. So do that. Make sure you're checking consistently against what you see in your setup. As you can see also, I'm holding the pencil at the end of the pencil. I'm not holding it all the way down near the point, because to do that would be to bear down further on the pencil. I can maintain a much lighter touch with it if I hold it at the end and have just as much control. It takes a little practice, but eventually you get the hang of it. As I move down here, and if you look at the subject, you'll see that there's a soft, very soft merging of halftones here, where the reflected light almost appears to just come up and dissolve into the light. And so I'm going to be trying to pull that off by very gently matching the tones between the shadow side of reflected light and the light. Not an easy thing to do here. It's a little bit more difficult because it's a very sort of fragile and delicate turning. I realize that my drawing may look a lot grainier on camera than it does in person. There's not much I can do about that, I'm sorry. So I'm allowing, here I'm going back in and I'm going to just fill in some of these spaces so that I can very carefully pull these two areas together. It's pretty delicate work, but that's what makes graphite so beautiful, is that you can get these really, really gentle transitions as long as you're being really careful and you're taking your time with your strokes and your stroke direction. So here, although this was done with a softer pencil, I'm going over it with a 2B, because by doing that, I can get rid of some of the graininess in here and dissolve these two areas more closely together. I'm going to go back to a slightly softer pencil here, as there's a soft merging or smudging almost of halftones in this area, and I want to try to capture that with a slightly softer pencil. It's not much of a difference between these two pencils, between the 2B and the 3B, but it's enough that it'll help me to achieve what I'm looking for here. I can see some areas I want to clean up a little bit, so I'm going to just go in and kind of lift off some areas and then go back into it with the 3B. Even there, I can want to be really picky. So now, I'm still in the halftone range here, and I think I can comfortably continue on with a 2B into these areas and then move into an HB. Normally, depending on how sharp or how abrupt the change in value is, I'll only carry a 2B about this far, but this is pretty, there's enough halftones in here that a 2B will do nicely for the job. And my 2B happens to be a pretty relatively hard 2B, almost like an HB, so it seems to be doing quite well in the lighter, harder ranges. I'm not going to carry it too much further, though. I'm going to switch to an HB in just a minute. So there's some areas here that need a little merging. That's this area here and this area here that I had done just previously. So what I want to do is I want to go in, and with my eraser, I'm just going to lift up a little bit into those transition spots. And then come back gently with my 2B. And see if I can't bring those two together a little bit nicer. That seems to have done the trick. So now I want to move up this way a little bit, and I'm going to start moving into an HB, I think. See how that does for me. So I have an HB and a mechanical pencil. So I'm not pressing down ever on my pencils. I'm just going back over the areas, allowing the graphite to build slowly on its own. Again, a transitional area that I think could use a little help. Now I want to start pulling in the background here so that I can ascertain whether or not my values are correct around here. And so in order to get this darker value, I'm going to need to move back into my soft tones. And I want to pull some of those up around this edge now so that I can make sure that I'm getting the correct value differences or contrast between this area of lights and this area of background. So I'm going to move back into my, I think, I'm going to try a real soft pencil here. This is an 8B. See if I can't get that in. Of course, when I squint at this area and this area on my setup, this area looks really dark by contrast because I'm looking at a light area against a dark area, so it's going to appear naturally darker to me than it is. So I have to be very cautious about that and be really careful that I'm not overdoing the dark. So here I'm using one of my woodless pencils. Moving back my hand because I don't want to make a really dark, heavy line with them. And here I'm not going to even have to lighten up this pencil because I think I can come right up to the edge of it and match it with the background tone. So it will virtually disappear and just, it will become one with the background. There are no lines in nature. What there are instead, what appear to be lines, caused by two contrasting values, a lighter value against a darker value, or one color against another that appears to be different in terms of temperature or value, or both. And then that creates the illusion of line. I don't have as much control here as I normally would because I have to stay out of the view of the camera. So I may not be getting you a perfect line here like I'd like to. It's a little hard from the angle at which I'm working. And I'm sorry if I get in your way or impede your view. I'm trying very hard not to do that. So I'm studying my background too because I want to make certain that the value changes are not happening as the background, as I draw closer to the light source. It is getting lighter, but not so much down here as up here out of sight of the viewer. So I'm not worried too much about it. There's a very slight value change going from here to here, very, very slight, and I'll try to capture some of that, but for the most part, it's not a huge value change. At least not down here, close to the ball. Up further, yes. So very close to that line, I'm going parallel to it with some soft circles, more like ovals. Trying to match that line as much as possible. Where it gets a little dark, I'm going to just lift off some of it, lighten it up just a bit. Make it a little easier to match up to. This looks pretty grainy, and you can see a lot of my pencil lines here. I'm going to try to smooth that out a little bit and show you how I do that. Some areas are just a little too liney. I remember my teacher using that word a lot. Liney. I think he used it for something different though. He was trying to tell us to not outline things. To try to avoid that look in our work. I like to avoid it in here too. The more you do graphite work, the better you'll get. It's been a long time since I've had to do it, or since I've wanted to. I do demonstrate for my students quite often on their work. And so that's about the only time I ever get any practice with it. The rest of the time I'm working in oils. So, or bookbinding, which is another preoccupation of mine. Clean up work here. Hard to do from this angle because I'm coming around from the left and I want to be coming around from the right. I'm going to get back to my HB. Actually, that was a 3B in the corner here. Some of you may look at this work and think, oh God, I just don't want to work like this. It's a little too painstaking for me. And I would not blame you at all. It's not what a lot of artists would choose to do. But for some people love this work. And I know a lot of my students, when they first learn it, they're thinking, oh, what a pain. And then after they learn to master it, they really like it. They're almost reluctant to move on from it into the next stage of their training. So it does depend on your particular temperament and what it is you like to do. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, it's a great training for your eye and learning to understand value and value relationships. Mainly because you have lots of time to do it. It takes so long to do this work, by the time you've finished a major project in it, you've really learned your values. You're also ready to move on. This is not considered a major project. My class has to do one major still life setup or plaster cast in nothing but graphite. And we're talking a much, much larger thing and much, much more complex than just a sphere. In school, we would also do that, very large still life setups or plaster casts. Some students actually didn't even finish theirs for the first year. They would go back and try to finish them later, or work on them slowly throughout the year. So I'm moving up now into an HB, because I'm moving up into the top areas where there's a lot of light hitting the ball. A little cramp in my hand there. And I'm holding that pencil really light. It's my age. So my teacher used to like to say that at this point you want to be like a little ant crawling across the surface. If this was a plaster cast, there'd be all kinds of little nuances and pits and little changes in the surface texture of the subject that you'd be drawing, and so you'd be wanting to capture all that. With this kind of clean little ball, smooth surface, there's really not much to capture other than the change in value. But same difference, you really want to go slow so you have a chance to measure and take note of any changes that are happening in the ball insofar as the value changes are concerned. There's a lot of light up in here, so I'm going to be switching to a 2H to capture that. But you can see that there's a very slow change happening here. There's more I could be doing in here, and I want to come back and see if I can't capture some of those halftones. The halftones are really important. Without them, you just don't get your subject to look relatively flat, and you definitely don't want that. I'm going to be going back to about a 3B in that area. Seeing if I can't pick up more of those halftones. It's a slow turn. I want to capture that. Sometimes in order to get that, I need to go a little bit darker than I normally would, or than you would normally appear in the bowl. That's so that you can, because you can't get lighter than light. You can't get whiter than the white of the paper. And in order to capture really, really bright light or highlight on something even white, such as plaster, sometimes you have to conserve your values by using a few less values and going a little darker in certain areas in order to bring out the lights more. That's another lesson, conservation of values. You might want to do a search for that on YouTube and see what you can find. I have several exercises I do with my students for that, but it's another lesson altogether. Now, some people would say that you would want to work on wouldn't this be easier if you were working on a tabletop surface? Well, ergonomically, it would be much easier for you, for your arms, your shoulder, probably your neck and your back, but you wouldn't be able to look at your work quite the same way. You wouldn't be able to see it the same way you can when it's on a vertical surface. So you constantly have to be having to pick your work up and do this with it, hold it back so you can see it. And that might, that could be a problem, especially if you get so intensely into work that you forget to do that. Because what'll happen is you'll finish a section or a session, step back and go, oh no, I missed this, or I didn't see that. And that's something that you would have captured most likely if your work had been vertical. So better to work vertical, take breaks, try to find an ergonomic position that works well for you. Certainly not one in front of a camera like this, but that would allow you to see your work and keep track of any mistakes that you might be making in it. So I hope you're all staying safe, because I'm filming this video during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, I should say. Lots of time indoors, or at least lots of time away from others at home, and so I'm finding things to fill in all that time. Hope you're enjoying this. Sort of like watching grass grow. Don't I know it? Okay, so now I'm moving into a much lighter area, because the light is coming down and it's hitting this circle of, or this area of the bowl. It's kind of like a little circle. And so it gets much, much lighter here. I'm moving again. I'm going to move into my 2B. That was a 3. This is a pretty hard 2B. It's almost like an HB. So I can use it in some of these areas, and I'm going to do my HB and then move into a 2H. So here's my HB. You can see a transition area here between the two values. I'm going to come back and try to clean that up a little bit. But I want to get some of this HB graphite down first. And I also want to start getting in this background here. Okay, so I'm going to move now into my 2H, which is really a hard pencil. This is as hard as I tend to go. You really don't need to go into those hugely like 7Hs and 5Hs. Just a 2H does the trick usually. You really have to get light, then you just ignore the ball. Or I should say ignore the graphite altogether and let the light of paper become your bright. So you would want to let your 2H just dissolve into the paper at that point, which we're going to do a little of here. You can see me coming back and using the pencil to dissolve some of these areas into each other. I'm seeing some areas that I would like to dissolve a little bit more on the bowl, right around the foreshadow and Terminator Line area. I'm going to use my 2B with a lot of circles to do that. It's a hard pencil, but while I'm working with it, it will dissolve some of this graininess and smooth it out some. making it a little easier to pull off this change between one area and another on the ball. Using my 2H, I'm going to come back in here too, and now I can really clean up some of this graininess by going over the softer pencil with a really hard pencil. Watch as some of that graininess disappears. I keep rotating the pencil because that maintains a very sharp point. I haven't really had to sharpen my pencils much in this process today because I have a very light touch and I keep rotating the pencil as I go. You can see how that hard pencil is really doing a nice job though on removing all the graininess or most of the graininess from the soft areas. It fills in the areas that the soft pencil did not, making, without really changing the value very much at all on the drawing. Back to a 2B. Just in this little area here, I want to soften these values up, soften this transition a bit. Get more of my halftones. Teacher used to say that. Used to walk up behind us and say, more in the halftones, more in the halftones. And it's something I do with my students now. I have to laugh about it. I can still hear my teacher's voice in my head. I want to start getting in some of this background now. I'm going to go back to my, I think I had an 8B here. It's easy to get in most of these tones here. Again, staying parallel to this line and keeping it very soft. Backing off my pencil a little bit. Really not trying to show any stroke direction here, just keeping it very, very light. I just want to stay close to that line or that division between the light and the background, but keeping my strokes into very sort of narrow oval strokes that parallel the side of the ball, something that I can quite easily work into with diagonal strokes in the background. So I've got my preliminary in now. I just want to bring the value up to the way I see it. It's much darker or appears to be. It's a little bit, some of that's an illusion because it's the light contrast against the background. But I want to recreate some of that same illusion in my drawing. Again, not bearing down, just going back over with the same pressure, letting the graphite build up. Rotating my pencil, because as you rotate, you'll find that you have, it'll be easier to get darker because your point will stay nice and fresh. And you can see how much easier now it is to pull those two areas together. As I get closer to the ball, I don't have to worry about going over because I've got enough area here to work into without making a mess. So the control remains in a good standard here, standing. So what I'm doing now is I'm looking very carefully at the value difference in contrast between the tabletop and the background piece of paper, so that if I get that value contrast correct, then, and you'll notice that I've been doing this all along, I'm looking constantly at the contrast between any three edges, or two edges, depending on how many I've got that I'm working with. And I'm always looking to see that I squint at my subject and I squint back at my drawing and I look to see if that contrast is the same. The use of a black mirror, which I'll illustrate a little bit for you at the end of this video, is also very helpful. But squinting is your friend. The best artists I know have wonderful curl lines around their eyes. So this is looking pretty good. I'm going to take my HB and come into these areas here and soften them up a little bit. Get some more into the half tones. You can tell how hard this pencil is because you can hear it as it works onto the paper. More of a scratchy sound. I'm going to switch to my softer pencil here just to clean up my edges a bit. And I want to expand this area just a touch, give you a better idea of what that should look like. This moat is not necessary once you become really experienced in graphite and in reading values. A lot of artists will choose not to put any kind of a moat or a background around their piece. But when my students are starting out, or when you're starting out, I insist upon it because it helps to understand your values better and to read them more accurately when you have two areas to contrast against each other. It helps you to maintain control of those values and value shifts, and therefore of your work. And gives you a more comprehensive understanding of what we call global values as well. So what do we mean by global values? Global values are the shifts or the changes that happen in value across a spectrum or across a form when light is falling from a distance and touching different parts of the form in different intensity. For instance, a light up here is going to be hitting first to this portion of the ball and then falling away as it moves down the form. So light here is also light here, but the light here is not as bright as the light up here because this light is farther from the source. So as the light moves down the form, it becomes subtly darker, darker, until eventually you are hitting a shadow line or a Terminator line and then moving across into shadow. But that's what's important, because so often when we jump around the form and we attack this value and then this value and then we go back to this value and then we go back to this value, without keeping track of how they're changing as they move around the form, checking with your squinting and checking with a black mirror, you will lose control of those values. You will tend to make the values here just as light as the values there. And that is going to be a big mistake. So that's what we call global values, and working with all the tools that I've been mentioning, including this idea of doing a moat to find contrast and help you register that and measure that contrast between two areas of the form, will help you to maintain that control and understand your global value system on the subject that you're drawing. Now, if you're working from a photograph, you're going to find it very, very difficult to get a really good understanding of value change, because photographs tend to darken your values, or at least your shadows tend to be very dense. much more so than they are when you're looking at them in life. And the reason for that is that the camera will focus on one area to the detriment of another. It just doesn't see the way your brain and your eyes do. There's a lot more light and shadows than you're going to see with the camera. And you really want to train your eyes to see form and see light as accurately as possible. Once you have a really good handle on how to do that from life, it gets a little easier to actually work from a photograph, because you'll understand what's happening in the photograph and can make changes for it. Here I'm taking my hard pencil and I'm just evening out some of these values and the tone a little bit, trying to get rid of some of that choppiness. And I normally would not do this until the very end, but I don't want to extend the video longer than it needs to be, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit here to show you how that works. By working a hard pencil into the soft areas, it doesn't change the value to any recognizable degree, but it does fill in those little gaps and smooth out your hard pencil, your soft pencil. And so the graininess tends to be cleaned up by doing this. You don't want to do it before you've had a chance to make all your corrections, because once you've done this, you're filling in the tooth. And then it gets very hard to erase anything or to change anything. So make sure that you've gotten it to your drawing to a point where you can do this before you lay in with a hard pencil. You want to make sure you've caught all your mistakes and really checked your values. So tend to wait maybe 24 hours or even a little longer. Put your drawing to the wall, come back and do it again. Look at it again. Compare it to the subject, your setup, and see if you need to make any changes before you dive in there with a hard pencil. But you can see how that really does a nice job on cleaning it up. I'm going to come in here now and just find some of those halftones that need a little bit of work. Come back in with my HB. So I would be really working on this if this was going to be a finished drawing for sale. I'd be, or even for peer review, I'd be spending a lot of time cleaning up all these little areas, really perfecting things, turning the ball, or the form as we like to say, making it as three-dimensional as I possibly can. For the sake of this demo, though, I think I've pretty much covered it. The only thing I want to do is bring in a little bit of value change down here so you can see how the whole piece comes together. And as an instructional video, it's fairly good, I think. It pretty much covers the basics for you, tells you what you need to know. Most of this, the only way you're going to learn it is to do it. And it really does help if you've got someone who can critique your work with you, who's got a sharp eye, who can see it for you, with you, and can tell you or point out for you areas that you may be lacking in or need to work on. So let's just get in these lower values here. I'm going to go to a soft pencil. I'm going to go back to my 8. Here, yeah, actually, I think I might just skip that and go to a 6B. There's tabletop gets much darker as it comes forward in the picture plane, and that's because the light's back here, and so of course as the light hits here, it's not as intense as it is back into these areas. So there is a subtle change here that happens where the actual tabletop gets a little darker. Okay, I've blocked your view there. Sorry for that. Sure, when I edit this, I'm going to be looking for those times when I really got in the way. You can hear that there's a burr on my pencil, which sometimes happens. It's just a little piece of graphite that's not as smooth as the rest of the graphite in the pencil. And you'll hear it scratching. When I hear that, I usually take the pencil and rub it on a piece of sandpaper or on another rougher surface just to pull that burr off. I want this shadow to really soften out, this cast shadow, to really soften out as it moves away from the subject of the ball, because it does, and the setup gets nice and soft out here, and then slowly fades into the light of the table. Remember that as a shadow moves away from its subject, it has more light cast into it. There's a drawing going on in here. I wanted to just get some of that drawing out. And so as a result, it softens up at its edges as it fades. Now, sometimes you'll see a really harsh line here, and that's if you're using a very direct light source. Natural light, coming in, for instance, from a north window, such as mine, will really soften that out. You won't be able to see any distinct lines at all. As a matter of fact, the shadows really sort of dissolve really beautifully on the subject. That's the light I prefer to paint in, but for the purposes of this subject, I used a direct light, and I softened it with a little bit of light from my north window. So there's a little bit of softening going on, but for the most part, you can see that it's a very distinct cast shadow. Now, if I were going to be doing this video over, I think I probably would have chosen to do the tabletop in a horizontal stroke, just to imitate the grain of the wood and to give you a more distinct feeling of the change in surface. But, and then that would have also made the ball turn more, because these strokes were up here would have been all diagonal, and then that's where you want the viewer's eyes to go, is in the lights, not in the darks. But I really wanted to illustrate for you the differences between your pencil strokes and the importance of using diagonals in the lit areas as opposed to horizontal strokes in the shadow areas. Again, that's something that you don't want to change in the lights, but you can feel free to change a little bit in your and the lights of the form. But if you're dealing with a surface such as a tabletop, it may behoove you to go horizontally in those surfaces, also in your background, to keep them flat and to keep the viewer's eyes from being drawn to them. If you're doing this in a really, really meticulous way, you won't have any real strokes that people will notice. And you can always choose, and I'll do this just for a little illustration purpose here, to come back in a diagonal going the other way, and that subtle cross-hatching will eliminate any strokes whatsoever. So there you can see in that little area there, the difference between that area and here, because I've just gone over it diagonally in the opposite direction, pretty much removing the diagonal stroke direction and or the obviousness of it. The idea is really you don't want to see too much of any stroke direction if you can avoid it. In really finite graphite drawing, the idea is to just make it as smooth and as perfect as you possibly can. But actually, that's my preferred method of working for a lot of areas, and especially when I'm crossing the core shadow. I tend to want to come back in a diagonal stroke this way because I find that it helps you make those transitions in a nicer form, in a nicer manner. Takes on a nice look, but always in the shadows, horizontal. And the reason we do that again is because we don't want the viewer's eyes going to the shadows. We want the viewer's eyes going here. All that lovely stuff is happening. So I see some halftones up here. I'm just going to be trying to get some of those in. It's a little hard to let go of things, you know. Especially because I know everybody's going to be looking at this and I'll be hearing all kinds of comments later about what I didn't do or what I should have done. Okay, so I want to get my shoulder up, come back, do a little bit of cross-hatching here to smooth this area out, clean it up. Back to my HB. This concludes my video, a small lesson on how to render in Graphite. There were a couple things that I didn't necessarily go into at the beginning of the video that I'd just like to touch on now. One of them that I mentioned throughout the video is the use of a black mirror. This is a black mirror. Now, it's really just a piece of clear acetate that has been spray painted with black on the back, and then I just taped off the edges so that I wouldn't cut myself on them because they tend to be a little sharp. And the way you use this is you want to look at your subject and at your drawing at the same time, and you hold this over your head, looking up into it in such a way that you can see both images reflected upside down in the black mirror. Now, it's not a direct representation of the values because it's dark, so your values would be just a tinge darker than they would be in reality. But it does allow you to see very clearly global relationship and value relationship changes throughout both the subject and the drawing, things that would not be necessarily readily available to your natural eyesight. You wouldn't, until you've really learned to see and your eyes are developed and become sensitive to these nuances. It's difficult to see some of those light changes, even for the more experienced person, especially when we get a little older. If we're developing cataracts or any of those problems, this will help to overcome that. It's a lot like looking through a red glass, only you don't have the disruption of the red glass or the color to get in the way. It allows you to really see clearly value relationships and to see those global values. My students are often shocked by what they can see. Sometimes I'll actually squint into this as well as squinting at the work, and then I'm really able to see those value changes that were normally not as obvious to me with just looking with my eyes. Another thing that you may have seen me using is a Maul stick, and a Maul stick is really just a stick, any kind of a stick. A dowel will do if you've got a little rubber tip on the end of it. For instance, this has a rubber tip on the end, so a lot of dowels that you can buy that are ready-made, you place that against the drawing and you can lean against it. I like a cane for obvious reasons. I don't have to hold it. I could just drape it over my easel or over a canvas or a piece of board, and then both hands are free to do whatever I need to do and to just move this about as necessary. This way you don't lean your hand against your work, you don't smudge your work, you can still maintain some measure of control with your hand. Now, you don't need to, you can buy these, and they're relatively expensive at an art supply store for what amounts to nothing more than a piece of a stick with a piece of rubber on the end. Some people just get curtain rods. They already have a little rubber stopper on the end, and you can use those. Or just go to your Goodwill, where you're sure to find an old cane that you can use too. Many artists, famous artists, use canes because they're so handy to have. And anyway, that's it. That concludes our video. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them. And if you like it, give it a thumbs up. It's always nice to get those. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.